Hi, I'm personal trainer YUJI.
Pumping up the pectoralis major is a man's hobby. There is no drink more intoxicating than seeing your pumped up pectoralis major in the mirror. I know this sounds quite narcissistic, but, well, usually I introduce some softer types of workouts. However, that said, among those watching, there might be some who say, "No, that's not me. I really want to know how to build my pectoralis major properly, even at 40, 50, or 60 years old." I think that today I would like to talk about some serious aspects of this topic. However, when I say serious, it's important to note that this is aimed at people in their 40s and 50s, so it's not about lifting extremely heavy weights. Instead, I will introduce a different approach. Previously, I measured my pectoralis major before starting my training. I placed a measuring tape just above my nipple, which is about the upper line, and measured it there, along with my training. After measuring the subsequent pump, I found that the pectoralis major alone doesn't pump up much, and the back doesn't come into play. The pump for the back is a different matter. When I measured how much the pectoralis major pumped up after finishing the training, it didn't increase by 4 centimeters. 4 centimeters. If the chest gets bigger, that's quite something. Even I can see that there's a difference of 4 centimeters when I look in the mirror. I realized that the shape is quite different once I applied it. Well, I've always known that, but I had never measured it properly. When I measured it right away, it had pumped up by 4 centimeters. But just with this, the distance changed by 4 centimeters. The breathing was not done like this, exhaling and inhaling. I wanted to measure under the same conditions, so I measured the breathing under the same circumstances. However, I think the 4 centimeter change also depends on how much pectoralis major one originally has, but depending on the method, I believe it is possible to achieve a good pump up. The benefit of this pump up is that when the muscles are pumped up, blood and fluids gather here. And the reason they are gathering is because the pectoralis major is being used correctly, all the blood and fluids gather here to aid in recovery, which is essentially what pump up means. Therefore, while the pectoralis major is present and recovering, there won't be pump up in other areas. Rather, substances will gather in the areas that need recovery, leading to pump up and swelling. This means that pump up occurs because the muscle has been used correctly and has received the right stimulation. So training that leads to such phenomena will develop the muscle effectively. While the exact measurement in centimeters doesn't really matter, it's important that the areas used get pumped up. I want you to do that kind of training. Now, regarding the pectoralis major, when it comes to exercises that effectively pump it up, the first choice is the dumbbell press. It's not the barbell. When using a barbell, the grip width is fixed, which affects the contraction and stretching of the pectoralis major. It's not optimal. To use that barbell, the shoulder joint has to strain a bit. It's common for the triceps to engage strongly, which means it's not in the best state for optimal stretching and contracting of the pectoralis major. With dumbbells, you can move more freely, allowing for contraction of the pectoralis major around the shoulder joint. You stretch, contract, stretch. The arms with the dumbbells move accordingly, focusing primarily on the pectoralis major. This makes it easier to achieve a pump. And then there's the weight used at that time. Regarding the weight of the channel, you should reach your limit between 12 to 15 repetitions. Use a heavier weight. It's not about barely managing 10 repetitions from the start. Personally, when I first do the dumbbell press, I am already at the limit of 15 repetitions. It's really about barely managing 10 repetitions. I'm not starting from that point. The idea is to use that weight to ensure accurate movement. If you start with barely managing 10 repetitions, you probably won't be able to maintain the correct form in the next set. So initially, aim for a weight that allows you to reach your limit around 12 to 15 repetitions. It is important to do this accurately for a reason, especially regarding the number of sets. As you progress, it becomes increasingly difficult. Initially, you might start with 15 repetitions, but the number gradually decreases. Eventually, towards the end, you might only be able to manage around 10 repetitions at most, which makes it easier to achieve a pump-up effect. Additionally, there is something very important to consider. The forearms must be absolutely vertical. When viewed from the side, they should remain vertical during the upward movement as well. This vertical trajectory means that from above, the forearms are always vertical. When the weight is heavy, it often leads to the forearms being pushed inward. This can result in a position where the weight is primarily affecting the triceps rather than the pectoralis major. This is quite common, so it is important to keep the forearms moving while maintaining that vertical position. If you do not maintain a vertical position while moving, the load on the pectoralis major will simply escape. Therefore, to prevent the load from escaping, it is essential to keep the forearms in a vertical position, both from the side and from above. This is an absolute requirement. Furthermore, regarding the movement itself, when you are pushing up, the way you move is important. Do not lift with momentum. Instead, control the pectoralis major carefully. It's about doing it with speed. If we say slowly, well, it's about being able to control the movement of the pectoralis major at a slow speed. This is related to the fast technique mentioned earlier. This is also being pushed with the triceps. It's about the speed. You must control the speed of the contraction of the pectoralis major against the resistance of the pectoralis major. This is also very important. And you see, the biggest key point is indeed this. Considering the current weight, movement, and forearms, the main point is that when you are moving, you should only lift the lower half, especially. What this means is that you continue this feeling for the lower half. You keep going in this range of motion from 1 to 10 and then to 25, always maintaining that half. However, in reality, even if you think of it as half in your mind, you usually end up exerting about 70%. So, while it's okay if you're lifting around 70%, it doesn't mean you're not reaching the full 10% you think you are. It's just that in your mind, it's half. I think the range might be a bit narrow, but about 70% of what I just did feels like this. Now, as I move like this, if I try to do this range myself, it probably feels like half. Half seems a bit narrow. I wonder if that's okay. I feel like I want to lift more, but I keep it at half, repeating it with careful movements and keeping my forearms vertical. Number 2. So, you do it like this, until you can no longer lift. By doing this, you ensure that the load on the pectoralis major is maintained without letting it escape. You keep the tension throughout the contraction and extension. If you lift too much, it will loosen, and the force or load will be lost. To avoid that, you only go up to about 70% of your capacity, which creates a sort of cast training effect. You release it, right? In car training, you slightly restrict blood flow in this area, and then when you do exercises like arm curls, there is no blood flow. So the lactic acid, which is a waste product from the investment made by the muscles, accumulates here. It builds up and builds up until it becomes painful, even though it's light. Once you finish, if you suddenly release it, blood rushes in because it wants to quickly eliminate that lactic acid, so the blood gathers here. Well, that's the pump-up you experience when doing curling. Well, you can't really bind the pectoralis major here, so while applying proper load, you need to maintain a state where you are exerting force, keeping it tight. You stretch and contract repeatedly. It's like, have you ever done leg extensions? You contract and extend, but the load is completely fixed here and there, so the load doesn't escape at all. It feels more difficult in February, but during that time, you really have to squeeze. The team experiences constricted blood vessels. Even if you stretch, it pulls back, so the results shrink again. If you continue in that state, with poor blood flow, you won't be able to finish 10 reps without feeling it, right? So, with the dumbbell press, you replicate that same situation, and when you do that, a lot of blood flows in during a set. Well, you only lift half of it, or maybe just 70%. So, that's how it is. Well, there was a set like that, and it means doing a bit more of such sets. When I say a bit more, it can mean various things, but just doing more isn't enough. It's important to do it correctly and then do a little extra. For those of you watching here, for example, doing 3 sets or maybe 4 sets each of the incline dumbbell press and the flat dumbbell press, totaling around 6 to 8 sets, would be a good amount to pump up effectively. Well, that's my thought. It's long, and well, I do it my way, but I usually do a bit more sets. Right now, I only have half of that. Even if done correctly, you won't really get a pump with just 2 or 3 sets. So, repeating around 6 to 8 sets significantly increases blood flow, leading to a good pump. Also, one more thing, this method is completely different, but it's important to properly consume carbohydrates before strength training. It is important to drink water steadily in small sips during exercise. The intake of carbohydrates and water is quite essential. Well, carbohydrates are basically fine to get from regular meals, like rice. However, when doing strength training, you shouldn't be in a very hungry state, having eaten 5, 6, or 7 hours prior. Essentially, you should have eaten at least 3 hours before training. If you want to ensure proper pump-up, I think eating about 1 to 2 hours beforehand is also fine. Well, something like that with rice. I think it would be good to have that. Well, it doesn't really matter if there's meat or not, but right now, I'm just talking about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates should be properly consumed about an hour before. Also, make sure to hydrate well. During exercise, you should sip water continuously. If you don't do this, the glycogen in your muscle cells will gradually deplete, leading to a loss of energy. When glycogen is used, water is also released simultaneously, causing the muscle cells to shrink. If you properly consume carbohydrates in advance, they will be replenished over time, probably around 2 hours later. This way, even if you use up the glycogen, it will keep getting replenished, and if you also hydrate, you'll have a good balance of glycogen and water. This will increase blood flow and help with the pump. Both will create a fuller state, making it easier to achieve a pump. So, in a different sense, it's important to properly consume carbohydrates before exercising. Water is also crucial. If you do this well, I believe you can achieve a pump of about 2 centimeters for sure. Well, the rest is up to you. Depending on the amount of muscle, I think you can pump up even more. Yes, and once you pump up, please indulge yourself by looking in the mirror, but make sure no one is watching. Well, by repeatedly doing such training, you will gradually develop your pectoralis major, so I encourage you to try training with pump up as a guideline.
Please subscribe the channel and follow my Instagram and X. I hope to see you next time. ありがとうございます。